Members of Congress here in the United States have been responding to the various crises coming out of China, whether it's the coronavirus and their lack of transparency on that, or now they're clamping down on democracy and freedom in Hong Kong. Joining me now to talk about these efforts is an author of several of the measures, Congressman Mark Green. He represents the 7th Congressional District of Tennessee. He is a decorated Army veteran, and he serves on the House Committee on Homeland Security as well as the Subcommittee on National Security. Congressman Green, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Well, hey, Tony. Thanks for having me on.
Disturbing, I would say, of what we see happening in Hong Kong this week as the communists from China begin to clamp down on those that have been speaking out for democracy and freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. You look at the implementation of this new rule, which basically gives them the same powers of the state they have in China, in Hong Kong. And that is basically, if there's dissent, it can be titled as treason, and they can be executed with no due process. I mean, it is absurd what they're trying to do. They're violating the treaty that they had. Fascinating today. I don't know if you saw that, but I saw this. But UK just granted 3 million of them citizenship.
And that's significant. A population of about 7 million. This is combined with the other activities of China, or lack thereof, in terms of their transparency with the coronavirus and how they set on that. And as a result, literally hundreds of thousands of people around the world have died. Members of Congress here have been working on a number of measures. You've been working on a number of these measures to hold China accountable. And from my perspective, as I see this coming from both sides of the aisle, I'm of the persuasion that we may actually see something happen here.
There is certainly a growing chorus in the Congress that is not just Republicans. We've got some bipartisan support here for doing something. Very clearly, China lied and Americans died. And there are estimates, had they spoken as early as 3 weeks prior, then when they did, we could have saved 96% of the deaths. So it's a huge amount of Americans that died because they failed to say anything on the COVID. What it's pointed out to us is that we got to make changes in things like our supply chains for PPE and medicines. We got to watch our national security assets because they're using the economic downturn to buy up all these companies that impact our national security. We got to figure out all the things that Americans are doing to help the Chinese and blunt it where we can. So,
well, and as you said, this is an opportunity. Congress is focusing on this. Many members of Congress focusing on this. I mean, there's so many different aspects, and that's why you actually have, I think, about 4 different bills addressing different aspects. Share with our listeners kind of what's at top of your list when it comes to China and correcting the situation that got us into this position.
Sure. I think our number one issue is the manufacturing piece. And so I've got a bill that will actually allow companies who move their manufacturing from China back to the United States to expense that in year one, the entire cost of the move. That's one of my bills. And I think it's probably the number one issue. We've got a lot of other issues, though, but that's probably the most important. One, it'll create jobs back home. 2, it makes us less dependent, especially in those areas like pharmaceutical precursors and PPE. So, that's one of them.
And that was one of our big issues when the pandemic began to spread, is that it took us a while to get access to the personal protective equipment because it was being manufactured in China. Of course, you add to that the pharmaceutical aspect and how many of the elements are also created there in China.
Yeah, so it's the PPE issue is particularly enlightening because what China did in January and February was essentially take PPE from all over the world, and much of it was donated. And Italy donated millions of dollars of PPE to China, and then when they needed it, China sold it back to them. And in the case of the United States, China came up with all these reasons why it couldn't be shipped to us. So we sent them $30-something billion worth of PPE in January and February, and then they turned around and wouldn't ship us any when we hit our peak. So this relationship, they are not a friend, and it's time that all of Americans recognize that.
What would be next in terms of your priorities as we deal with China?
I think the next thing is to look at, we gave money to this Wuhan laboratory. And we're discovering that American aid dollars went to this Wuhan laboratory. What other American agencies have been giving money to China? So my latest bill is basically requiring all agencies of the federal government to report to Congress exactly when any financial aid, any American dollars are spent either for China or for an agency of China. So that's a really exciting one. Again, something that could be easily passed because all we're asking for is an accounting. And I think the Democrats are going to like that bill.
When you look at, the overwhelming evidence that China has acted in, I would say in almost in a hostile way, certainly indifferent toward American interest and global interest. Will the pressure be there to get something across the line, a bipartisan measure that is significant and that does hold China accountable?
The only barrier is politics, Tony, and that's a big barrier because right now no one on the left wants to give Donald Trump a win. And they by default then don't want to give Republicans a win, especially in the House where Pelosi is doing everything she can to maintain power. So that's the barrier. So if we want to be hard or tough on China, that's something that the government or that the president is his theme. So if we go out there and are tough on China, they're going to make it look like, or we will, others might make it look like they're supporting the president, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So they may push back just because of that. 3 years ago, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer were very anti-China. And now you don't hear any of that from them because Trump is. So that political dynamic could interrupt the potential for some bipartisan legislation. That's what we have to overcome.
That's a shame. I think this is the one moment in time in the last 2 decades where we can recalibrate and reset the relationship with China. We have someone in the White House who has the determination to do it. We have the motivation to do it because of all that has unfolded, and I think there is the support across the country to do it. And the only thing missing would be the political will here in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and we've seen that political will, that dichotomy I just described, railroad really good bipartisan legislation, or sidetrack or whatever the right term is. For example, good legislation to save rural hospitals from closing can't get heard in Congress because the majority party doesn't want to give the minority party a win.
Well, that's tragic for the American people. That it's more about politics and parties than it is the people and the future of the country. Congressman,
that's where we are.
Congressman Mark Green, I want to thank you for taking time out to join us today, and we want to continue to track these issues as it pertains to China, and so we want to follow back up with you here in the not-too-distant future to see if these measures are, in fact, moving forward. So thanks for your leadership on this front.
Tony. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me on the show. Always a pleasure.
All right.